the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, called pseudo by Orthodox authorities from around the 3rd or 4th century onwards, but no more pseudo really than any of the other books we have. Pseudo simply means it was written in the name of Clement. Well, we have books written in the name of Mark, written in the name of Matthew, and so on and so forth, and we're not sure of those authorships either or what they're saying. So the Pseudo-Clementines are only pseudo insofar as the ideas in them are somewhat antithetical to the established credo of the time. But in any case, in those Pseudo-Clementines, a romance, something like Acts. Pseudo-Clementines are like an anti-Acts. An Acts from the perspective of what we call Jewish Christianity. I think it's a poor term, but it means a philo-Jewish form of Christianity instead of a somewhat, well, many people would argue about this. I'm sure some of you will argue with me about this too. Somewhat anti-Semitic view, anti-Semitic type of Christianity. I say that because, you know, Paul in Thessalonians, whether you like it or not, said in some sense that the Jews are the enemies of the whole human race. And they killed all of the prophets. And they killed the latest ones too. That, by the way, credo was picked up in the Quran too, and is repeated there by Muhammad to deleterious effects that we all witness worldwide. Anyway, these Pseudo-Clementines, which are rather philo-Semitic, not anti-Semitic, Acts, these Pseudo-Clementines have an attack by Paul on James in the temple. The recognitions anyway does. An attack by Paul on James in the temple. Now, if you line the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions up with the book of Acts, you will find that this takes place exactly where the attack by the Jews on Stephen occurs. Now, I'm not the first person who've said this. Hans Joachim Scheps, back in the 40s, a German-Swedish scholar who had to flee Germany during the Holocaust period and went to Sweden and then came back, he said this. He said Stephen was an overwrite for James, and for the attack on James by Paul. He said that first. I'm not the first to have said that. I didn't understand what he meant at that time, but I believe now, after much study, he's correct. You'll say, I'll try to get at the end, why were these overwrites? Why did these overwrites occur? And if it's not satisfactory to you, and by the way, by going into these overwrites, or some would say rewrites, I like the word overwrite better, by going into them, we can tease James out of the literature. We can find James, because whatever you say, we'll see James is an historical character, and some of these other people, in fact, are ahistorical characters. If you look at the attack on Stephen in the book of Acts, and you compare it with the materials I give you in James, the brother of Jesus, you'll find that you have Stephen down on his knees. The key testimony to James's historicity in Eusebius, a writer in the 4th century, and here we're getting to abstruse things, based on Hegesippus, who was one of the early church fathers closest to the events in question, writing around 150 or 160 CE, pictures James down on his knees in the attack on James. Also, you'll find the same vocabulary used and the same vision. Stephen sees the heavens open in the attack on James in the temple by the final death scene, not the attack by Paul in the Pseudo-Clementine recognitions, but the attack in Eusebius's version of early church history based upon Hegesippus. You know, Eusebius was Constantine's bishop and was instrumental in organizing the early church councils that brought about the Roman form of Christianity we now know as the dominant one. But originally he had been bishop in Caesarea in Palestine. So he was in touch with a lot of old Palestinian sources, particularly this Hegesippus, who never seems to have gone west and who was lost. So a lot of Western theologians and early church historians like Tertullian and Irenaeus don't seem to know Hegesippus. So there's a whole Eastern access composed of Hegesippus in the 2nd century, Origen in the 3rd century, who, by the way, was considered a heretic by some, and Eusebius, and then Jerome, who comes east, gets in touch with Palestinian sources. So all of these materials I set out for you. Finally, the actual prayer Stephen utters, not only the vision, the fact of his being on his knees, the actual prayer is word for word the speech James utters in the attack on the temple. So these are things you wouldn't ordinarily know if you didn't compare the sources. So you say, oh yeah, sure, the attack on James is overriding Stephen. Perhaps, but maybe it's the other way around, and that's for you, the reader, and the audience to decide. All I can do is give you my opinion. I put the sources out there, which is why we have 1,000 pages. My publishers wanted this book cut down to 350. One of the things which I think happens is that as James and Jamesian Christianity is written out of the documents, Pauline Christianity is written in, and anti-Semitism is also written in. Let me give you an example of where that occurs in my personal view. The characterization of Peter, the introducer already mentioned that I think James is the legitimate true successor of Jesus. Peter, too, is an important successor, but as you know, if you've read the scripture carefully, Peter is subservient in almost all instances to James, even in the picture of the book of Acts, which is very highly polemicized. Even there, in the final so-called Jerusalem Council scene in chapter 15, how many are familiar with that scene? The rulings. Who gives the final rulings, James or Peter? James. And Peter is there, and Peter must defer to James's rulings. Those rulings are so important. Because another key thing I didn't know before I started writing this book that came to me as I was writing this book. I know a lot of you are just beginning in this field. It sounds like Greek to you. This field is so complicated, and you have to comb at it with a fine-tooth comb, which is why so much pseudo-history. People will say, I'm writing pseudo-history. We'll see. And who will be the battleground? You folks are the battleground. You are the judge. Who's writing the pseudo-history? And who is overriding who? My book was reviewed in the New York Times by someone who was formerly associate editor of the Catholic Biblical Quarterly and Jesuit trained. Well, that's fair enough, but honestly, I don't think this is the kind of book that you should give to someone who is constrained to certain beliefs. It's tough. But if you want to unravel this huge mystery and bring these people who've been consigned to the scrap heap of history back to life, the proofs are there. And they say, oh, you can't write this for the general public. The general public can't take this. Yes, they can. They can take it better than the scholarly public, because often the scholarly public has entrenched positions that they're unwilling to part with. They've learned this. If they didn't see this before, how come they didn't see that there was not a James, the son of Zebedee? How come they've been juggling 3 or 4 Jameses? How come we've been juggling 3 or 4 Marys, and there really probably is only one? How come there's so many Judases when there really is probably only one? Who is the one? Judas, the brother of James. Judas, the brother of James. Wherever, and that's what I show you, wherever the family of Jesus comes into question in the New Testament, we have problems of the historicity. And new characters suddenly appear. That this letter of James to Antioch, taken down by Judas Barsabbas. Who's Judas Barsabbas? Another one of these multiple Judases. These are all the same Judases. Judas Thomas, Judas the twin, Judas the Zealot, also known as Lebbaeus, also known as Thaddeus. If you compare your gospel lists, you'll find that Thaddeus, also known as Lebbaeus, surname Lebbaeus, takes the place of Judas of James in Luke. So in Matthew and Mark, you have Thaddeus, surnamed Lebbaeus. In Luke, you have Judas of James as this apostle. In the gospel list, called Simon the Zealot. How many are familiar with him? In other gospel, yes, maybe Iscariot too, because we'll show you in this book that Iscariot is related, of course, to Sichari or Sicarios. Well, there are other brothers. There is, as we know from the Gospels, James, Simon, Jude, and Joseph. I want to show you that this Simon is Simon the Zealot, one of the apostles, just as James is James the son of Alphaeus. And we draw these identifications very carefully over long argumentation, so you'll be able to see the parallels and from other sources that even make these identifications. There's a lost manuscript of Papias from the latter part of the 1st century that may not be ascribed properly, but it makes these identifications that James the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, etc., and Joses were the sons of Cleophas and Mary. But it also turns out that Jesus has a cousin, James has a cousin called Simeon Bar Cleophas. He is the second successor to James and the leader of the Jerusalem church, so-called. Well, Jerome, and I'll explain that to you in a moment, was the first person who decided that Jesus' brothers were not really brothers, but cousins. What if Jesus' brothers are cousins or vice versa, then Simeon Bar Cleophas is the same as Jesus' brother called Simon. In fact, I think they are identical, and I'll show you why. And we have other sources about Simon the Zealot. So all of those are recapitulated for you. Let's go back. I said, watch the brother theme, and you will never go wrong. The battleground in the whole argument is the book of Acts. Now, if you know, most scholars don't deal tremendously much with Acts. If they do, they depreciate Acts. A lot of scholars I know don't even accept Acts as an historical document. I do accept it as an historical document. But the first 15 chapters of Acts are tremendously worrisome. In chapter 16, right after the Jerusalem conference, what we call the we document cuts in. And there, James emerges in no uncertain terms. That is, in Paul's final visit to Jerusalem, do you remember that? In chapter 21, Acts, he comes up and James is clearly the leader. But a lot of people confuse him with the other James. And I'm sure many of you are confusing him. Who's the other James? James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of John. Well, he's already been killed in Acts, I think it is 12. He's already been removed when our James makes his first entrance. So this can't be James, the son of Zebedee. The only James this can be is James, the brother of Jesus. But Acts doesn't tell us who this James is. We only know that he's the leader of the community, and we have to go to outside sources. And finally, it is he that sends Paul into the temple, he that makes Paul pay for four others under Nazirite oath, where Paul gets mobbed and arrested. And Acts is basically following Paul's narrative. Acts leads off in 62 AD with Paul under loose house arrest, preaching freely in Rome. Most of us don't think that Paul died till 66 or 68. It doesn't cover those later years. But who died in 62? James. How do we know it? Josephus. James was killed in Jerusalem in 62, but Acts doesn't tell us about it. Why? Oh, it wasn't the point of its narrative, but you mean such an important event, the leader of the whole church, the leader of the Jerusalem community anyway, sometimes he's called bishop, sometimes he's called archbishop, shouldn't be covered in Acts when it ends in 62? I think it should be covered. And I think the original sources did cover it. You understand why? Look, we're not trying to hurt anyone's feelings here. What we're trying to do is to resurrect people from the oblivion they have been cast into in history. We're not hurting anything that Christianity has to say, because we're taking a brother of Jesus and bringing him back into life. You know, I think if Jesus were alive today and things were said and done in his name that were not his, he would want us to know that. There are statements said. There are wolf in sheep's clothing who are coming to deceive the flock. There are all kinds of polemical statements of that kind. So I think that if there were problems, and I think after the Holocaust, he would expect us to do this. If these things contributed to the Holocaust, and I'm going to show you some things that did contribute to the Holocaust, the mindset that caused that is fed into people's minds generation after generation as holy writ, as truth, when in fact a lot of people who believe in these things are embarrassed by those things themselves and would like a way out. I give a way out. Who? The closest person to Jesus, his successor, his closest living heir, his actual heir in Palestine, if not elsewhere. You know, at the end of my book, someone said in one review from the Jerusalem Post, Eisenman's conclusion is apocalyptic. That is, who and whatever, if you're looking for the historical Jesus, basically you need to search for the historical James. The Pseudo-Clementines say, and this is a statement attributed to Jesus, be like good money changers, able to tell false coin from true. I say if you're looking for the historical Jesus, you should look for the historical James. And who and whatever James was, so Jesus would also be. I'll come back to the Judas Iscariot thing in a moment, but since we're on the James thing, let me just tell you one quick point which is so moving and touching about James. From our other source I haven't even got into, I've done all the negatives. James was a vegetarian. I think because he kept the extreme purity regime of the Qumran community and then some. James was a Nazarite from his mother's womb. There's nothing of this that's offensive to any of us. All of us want to be holy. There are many of these things that are very sympathetic to us. So how do you know these things? James is the most documented person outside of the Bible of anybody in the New Testament. We have more extra biblical material about James than any other character, including Peter, including John the Baptist. The only one who compares with James for extra biblical material about him, you know, James is in the Nag Hammadi materials. The only one who compares is John the Baptist. We have a long testimony to John the Baptist where? In the Antiquities, in Josephus. But other than that, we don't have a lot of testimony to these people. Peter, we have very little about. Now, I will tell you something about Peter in a moment. All of these people, John the Baptist included. John is a vegetarian, you know, according to the Gospel of Luke. John was holy from his mother's womb, just like James was. That is a lifelong Nazarite. These people, according to the Pseudo-Clementines, whether right or wrong, you'll have to go to the Pseudo-Clementines and weigh them and see if they have anything in them. They're novels, true, but so the material we have is novelized. You have to compare one with the other, be like good money changers. But the characters that emerge are very sympathetic. Look, Peter, according to the Pseudo-Clementines, like James, is a vegetarian. You know, I have a dedication in this book, a quote from the Pseudo-Clementine Homilies, which quotes Peter preaching things we don't even have in Acts. And these are very old sources. They may not be as old as some of our other sources, but they're very old. Here is Peter, Pseudo-Clementine Homilies. Our Lord and prophet who has sent us declared to us that the evil one, having disputed with him 40 days, but failing to prevail against him, promised he would send apostles from among his subjects to deceive them. Therefore, above all, remember to shun. This is where I bring up, remember I mentioned to the community rule? And Josephus' Essenes too, they shun backsliders. They curse backsliders. But anyway, let's go on here. Therefore, remember to shun any apostle, teacher, or prophet who does not accurately compare his teaching with that of James, the brother of my Lord, and this even if he comes to you with recommendations. Pseudo-Clementine's Homilies, 1135, Peter preaching at Tripoli. How many have heard that? Nobody. Nobody. Few of us have, but the reason is these are the excluded materials. But some of these materials have pearls of wisdom. And if we don't know about the historicity, you'll have to be the judge of that. But look at the Peter that emerges in the Pseudo-Clementines. He's a daily bather. He's a vegetarian. He wears threadbare clothes like the Essenes. He rises before dawn and prays every day. Now, we don't get any material like that in the book of Acts at all. You can collate the speeches in the book of Acts attributed to Peter, and basically they recapitulate Pauline doctrine. Particularly that the Jews killed all the prophets, and the Jews are stiff-necked and always disobeying the Lord, etc., etc., etc. There are 5 speeches, I have counted them, where Peter says that. Just like Stephen says. Some say exactly the same thing. So my conclusion is, as James was written out, as I told you, anti-Semitism was written in. So I don't think that we're doing a disservice to this material. I believe we're rescuing it from extreme things that you would not want on your conscience. And you would want to historically revive what you would want on your conscience. And we are bringing these people, Jesus included, back to life as extreme holy people. Also, to my way of thinking, part of the uprising against Rome. Let me go back to 2 other episodes, and then I'll finish up at least this presentation. We're talking about the election. So what do we have? A Judas Iscariot. Someone actually voiced it here. Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscarios. That's the closest word we have to it. Judas the Sicarii were the extreme form of zealotry. But even I didn't know these things when I started writing, which is why it got so long. It turns out that in the 2nd century, the Romans saw all circumcisers as Sicarion. And they used this because, Josephus tells us that the Sicarii were the knife people who had daggers. And they assassinated people with these daggers. But there is a Roman law, the Lex Cornelius de Sicarius, which sees circumcision, at least in the 2nd century, as bodily mutilation. In fact, Origen supposedly mutilated himself, cut off his sexual parts. One of the reasons he was excommunicated. And it's in Jerome. And Jerome laughs at Origen in that particular instance. And this is said that Origen is a Sicarius because he took off his sexual parts with a knife. Sica is a Roman knife. So it's the circumcision knife as well as the terrorist knife. And that's a very interesting that I didn't even know. So when we go back to Judas Iscariot, or when we go back to the eunuch of the Ethiopian queen, we're dealing with people writing who know a lot more than we know. So Judas Iscariot is another one of these multiple Judases. Well, I don't want to get into too much of that, but Judas has become basically the pejorative in Western civilization for traitor. And all the family of Jesus are considered to some extent by the Western view somewhat traitors, backsliders to the Paul view. Now, you know that Paul in Galatians does treat his controversies with James, the brother of Jesus, and they're very severe, and he treats them in quite some detail. So I think that's a primary source. There's no overriding there. When you get down to these materials, where you get a primary source that you can rely on, that comes first. So the controversies of Paul and James are very extreme. You say, why could this have happened? Because the people in the West who followed the Pauline approach basically were antithetical to the people in the East who followed the Jamesian approach. And the documents we have come out of, to a certain extent, Greek quarters. They're written in Greek. They're written mostly from the point of view of those in the West, particularly after the fall of the temple. So it was very good. It was very easy to pejoricize people. But what you're basically doing is pejoricizing this Jewishy form of Christianity. I'm not advocating, I'm just stating a fact, this Nazarite form of Christianity, this holy from the mother's womb. So in the Judas Iscariot episode, I think we have a characterization. I don't think there really ever was a Judas Iscariot. The election to succeed Judas as such, as a betrayer of Jesus, to me that's part of the polemics of the period. So we get the election of Matthias to succeed who? the 12th apostle, to flesh out the 12th apostle scheme. But Paul doesn't even really know anything about the 12 apostle scheme. There are apostles plural. James is one. Paul makes it clear in Galatians that James is an apostle. Of the other apostles, I saw only Kepha and James. He makes it clear that James is an apostle, and I'm sure that James was an apostle, if we can characterize exactly what apostles were, which I tried to do in this book. But instead of electing an inconsequential 12th apostle to flesh out a idealized scheme, I think what we really had there in the earliest history was the election of James to succeed his brother Jesus. And you can do that all the way across. We get, as I told you, the attack on Stephen, taking the place of Paul's attack on James. Go to the Pseudo-Clementines. What happened? Paul threw James down the steps of the temple, left him for dead, but didn't kill him. Then James's group fled to the Jericho area. Very precise detail. Let's go into Peter, and we'll finish up. Peter is portrayed in Acts as greeting the Roman centurion Cornelius. And they're learning that he can accept Gentiles. This is a totally different view than the Pseudo-Clementines of Peter. And if you know, this episode reflects to some degree Paul's arguments in Corinthians and Galatians. Particularly in 1 Corinthians, Paul is laboring James's instructions to oversee community and talking about food, things sacrificed to idols, and saying, for him, everything is permitted. But when these weak people, these people with weak consciences, these vegetarians, and by that he clearly means James and his group, come, well, for their conscience's sake, refrain from eating. But Paul says, ultimately, all things in the butcher shops, marketplaces are clean. In the same breath, he enunciates his understanding of communion with the body and blood of Christ Jesus. Well, again, that's so complicated. We'd go into this book in great detail on that subject. But the point is, Peter, in the episode with the Roman centurion, gets Paulinized. Instead of the Pseudo-Clementine Peter in tatters, Peter observing extreme dietary laws, Peter preaching James's abstain from food sacrificed to idols is the key point. By the way, you know, in Josephus' description of the Essenes, they abstain from food sacrificed to idols, and they're willing to go to their deaths on this point. So all these people are joined in our sources. So it gets really interesting, the conjunction of all our sources. Well, Peter says in that episode, a tablecloth comes down from heaven. Peter standing on a rooftop in Jaffa. A tablecloth comes down from heaven, and Peter says, the voice says, eat, Peter, eat. And Peter said, no, Lord, I have never eaten any forbidden thing. I think that is the true Peter. And 3 times the voice cries out to them, and then what God has made clean, let no man set aside. And Peter learns that he should call no thing and no human profane. These are very noble thoughts, but I don't think they're the historical Jesus, or the historical Peter. They are the historical Paul. So these are where we have to look very, very carefully, and I give you a lot of other episodes. Finally, who was it who was responsible for James and the other brothers being cousins, or considered cousins in some of our religious traditions? Jerome, I said. Where did he get that? He got that from an episode in the Gospel of John, that Mary has a sister called Mary. Do you know that in the Gospel of John, Mary has a sister called Mary? Mary, sister of the mother of the Lord, and she's married to Clopas. You remember Clopas, again, I mentioned before, the father of Simeon Bar Cleopas, etc., the so-called uncle of Jesus. In Luke, Clopas is the first person to whom Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus with an unnamed other. All that is too complicated for us to deal with today, but it shows how complex our sources are and how much information really is here. Well, Mary has a sister called Mary. Jerome exploited that to say finally that these are the sons of Mary and Clopas. What I finally conclude in my book is that as the doctrine of the supernatural Christ gathered momentum in the 2nd century. Brothers became cousins, fathers became uncles, mothers turned into their own sisters. And in fact, I believe Jesus turned into his own brother. The 4th brother is who in gospel lore? Joses. Joses, which except for the vowel, we know anything about Joses. We know a lot about Simon. We know a lot about James. We know a lot about Judas. We know a lot about these other characters. James, we can fill books with, as we can see. Joses is the one we don't know because, in fact, Jesus turned into his own brother. Well, I leave you there. There's a lot I didn't cover, but that's why we have the book there. I hope you'll find it interesting. Thanks a lot for hearing my remarks today.
הפורט על מיתרים בשירה